They burned my sister for a crime she didn't commit. I filed the paperwork. For 11 years, I processed execution warrants for Subsector Administratum, believing every death served the Emperor's justice. Then I found her warrant, signed 4 weeks before her investigation began. How many innocents did my efficiency condemn? My name is Kael Vrost, and this is how I learned the Imperium runs on pre-determined conclusions disguised as judicial process. I am dead now. I have been dead for 7 months. The Arbits executed me at dawn on the 14th day of Secundus for refusal of duty and destruction of Imperial records. But before they dragged me to the execution square, I recorded this testimony on data, wafers hidden in 17 different locations across Hive Tertius. Someone must know. Someone must remember. Someone must understand what we are. Let me begin at the beginning, when I still believed. Quati Act 1. The Believer. The archive was maintained at 14 degrees. Cold enough to preserve parchment. Cold enough to keep the tech, priests as servitors from overheating during their endless filing routines. I worked in Archive Section Theta 7, Subsector Administratum, Processing Division, Casualty and Termination Records. My supervisor, Proctor Malice, called my work immaculate devotion. I was proud of that. Every morning, I arrived at the 3rd hour past midnight bell. The archive never slept, but the night shift appreciated precision. I would hang my coat on peg 17, always peg 17, and settle at my station with a cup of recaf that had gone cold during my transit from the Hab blocks. The recaf didn't matter. The ritual mattered. Order mattered. The Emperor's work required discipline. My role was specific cross-reference execution warrants against investigative reports, verify authorization signatures against Arbits judicial matrices, ensure proper documentation of charges and evidence, then file the completed records in the subsector mortality ledgers. Every name I entered represented justice delivered, order maintained. The Emperor's will made manifest through careful record keeping. 17,432 executions processed in 11 years. Not one filing error, not one misplaced document. My efficiency ratings were exemplary. I believed in the ledgers. I believed that imperial justice, while harsh, was fair. The guilty were punished. The innocent were protected. The system worked because people like me made it work, one careful verification at a time. My sister, Mira, thought I was wasted in the archives. She worked in Subsector Medica, pediatric ward, 3rd shift. We would meet every 7th day at the chapel of St. Margrave, share a meal in the refectory after devotions, talk about our weeks. She saved children. I preserved order. We both served. She used to tease me about my obsession with procedure. Kael, she'd say, her smile tired but genuine, do you ever wonder if maybe, just sometimes, the paperwork gets it wrong? The paperwork doesn't get it wrong. I'd tell her, people get it wrong. The paperwork just records what they did. That's why accuracy matters. She'd shake her head, but fondly. We were different, but we understood each other's devotion. The first anomaly appeared on a Secundus morning, 4th month of the administrative year. A simple discrepancy, easily explained. The execution warrant for one Tavik Soren, charged with sedition and distribution of heretical literature, had been signed by Arbits judge, Marshal Venn, on the 8th day of Primus. The investigative report from Arbits Precinctus Sem was dated the 19th day of Primus, 11 days after the warrant was issued. I flagged it for correction. Simple clerical error. Someone had transposed dates during transcription. It happened occasionally, though rarely. I filed a notation for archival amendment and continued my work. The second anomaly appeared 6 days later. Warrant issued on the 2nd of Secundus. Investigation concluded on the 14th. 12 days later. Different judge, different precinct. Different charges, this time harboring mutants. I filed another amendment request. The third anomaly appeared the next day. Then 2 more the day after that. I began keeping a personal log. Not because I suspected anything was wrong, because patterns in data fascinated me, and this was an unusual pattern. Clerical errors tended to be random, scattered across months and years. These were clustering. 5 cases in 2 weeks, all showing the same discrepancy. Warrants pre-dating the investigations they supposedly concluded. I mentioned it to Proctor Malice during our weekly efficiency review. He was a thin man with augmetic eyes that clicked when he focused, servomotors grinding in their sockets. 40 years in the archives had turned his skin the color of old parchment. Transcription errors, he said without looking up from my performance data slate. The judges sign warrants based on preliminary findings. The full investigative reports are filed later. The dates reflect different stages of the judicial process. That made sense. I returned to my station satisfied. The system was working as designed. I had simply misunderstood the workflow, but the pattern continued and expanded. By the end of the month, I had logged 23 cases. By the end of the second month, 47, all showing the same structure: warrants signed weeks, sometimes months, before investigations concluded. Some warrants were dated before investigations even began. I tried to dismiss it, tried to accept Malice's explanation, but I was good at my job precisely because I noticed patterns, because details mattered to me, and this detail wouldn't leave me alone. On the 73rd day since the first anomaly, I made a decision that would end my life. I began to investigate. Pompeii Act 2: The Unraveling. The archive held more than execution records. It held everything. Investigation reports, evidence logs, witness testimonies, judicial deliberations, authorization chains, requisition forms, transport manifests. 11 stories of filing chambers, 40,000 linear meters of shelving, 3 centuries of accumulated documentation. If you knew where to look, if you understood the classification systems, you could trace any decision back to its source. I knew where to look. I started with the simplest case: Tavik Soren. Sedition and distribution of heretical literature. Executed on the 10th day of Primus. Warrant signed on the 8th. Investigation report dated the 19th. I pulled the complete file. It took 6 hours to locate all the relevant documents, scattered across 3 different archive sections according to departmental classification protocols. Investigation transcripts in section row 4. Evidence logs in section sigma 12. Judicial authorization in section theta 7 where I worked. Each piece properly filed, properly preserved, properly maintained. I read the investigation report first. Arbit's investigator Karas had been thorough. 64 pages of witness interviews, document analysis, scene examinations. The conclusion was ambiguous. Subject Soren engaged in political criticism of planetary governors' grain requisition policies. Criticism employed religious metaphor questioning divine mandate. Evidence insufficient to establish deliberate heresy. Recommend censure and monitoring. Execution not warranted. The warrant said otherwise. Signed by Judge Marshall Venn 2 days before investigator Karas even began his inquiry. 11 days before the recommendation against execution. Someone had decided Tavik Soren would die before anyone investigated whether he deserved to. I told myself there must be an explanation. Preliminary intelligence. Prior evidence. Something that justified pre-signing the warrant. I searched for it. Found nothing. No prior investigation. No preliminary reports. No intelligence briefings. Just the warrant, floating in procedural void. Waiting for justification that never quite matched. I couldn't stop. I pulled the next case. Then the next. Then all 47. 23 of the 47 investigative reports concluded with recommendations against execution. Insufficient evidence. Ambiguous findings. Cases recommended for monitoring or lesser punishment. Every single one had been executed anyway. Every single warrant had been signed before the investigations concluded. Some before the investigations began. The pattern was worse than I'd thought. It wasn't administrative error. It was systematic. I spent my off hours in the archive. Stopped meeting Mira for our 7th-day meals. Sent apologetic Vox messages claiming expanded duties, additional responsibilities. She worried but understood. We all sacrificed for our service. I expanded my search, went back further. 5 years of execution records. 2,794 cases. I cross-referenced every execution against its investigation file. The work was meticulous, exhausting, necessary. I barely slept, barely ate. The archive became my world, and the pattern became my obsession. 43% of executions had warrants signed before investigations concluded. 43%. 1,202 people killed based on decisions made before evidence was gathered, before witnesses were interviewed, before anyone determined actual guilt. But that wasn't the worst part. I noticed something else in the files. Certain charges appeared in clusters. Sedition cases would spike dramatically for a 3-month period, then drop to nothing. Then harboring mutants would spike, then heretical practices, then sedition again. Like someone was working through a rotation. like someone had quotas to fill. I pulled the Munitorum resource allocation forms. The archive held those too, buried in section Omega-9, infrastructure and logistics. It took me 11 days to find what I was looking for. Execution facilities required maintenance. Pyres needed promethium. Mass graves needed excavation equipment. Body processing required servitor labor and chemical supplies. All of it requisitioned months in advance. All of it budgeted in the annual subsector operational plans. The requisition forms for the current administrative year had been filed 17 months prior. Someone had projected exactly how much promethium, how many servitor hours, how many burial plots would be needed. The projections were specific. Down to the liter, down to the cubic meter. They'd planned for 2,800 executions. The current year showed 2,794. We were on target, within 2% of projection. Someone had decided how many people would die this year before the year began, before crimes were committed, before investigations opened. The executions weren't responding to actual heresy or sedition or mutation. They were fulfilling a quota. The warrants came first. The justifications came later. I sat in the cold archive at 4th hour past midnight bell, surrounded by 17 months of evidence, and understood what I was looking at. This wasn't corruption of imperial justice. This was imperial justice. This was how it worked. This was how it had always worked. My hands were shaking. I noticed and tried to stop them. Couldn't. I had processed 17,000 executions. How many had been like this? How many names had I entered into the mortality ledgers, believing they represented guilty parties, when they'd simply represented numbers that needed to be filled? I thought of Tavik Soren, criticized grain requisitions, executed for it. I thought of the 23 cases with recommendations against execution, the 1,200 cases with pre-dated warrants, the quotas, the careful planning. I thought of my sister telling me the paperwork might be wrong sometimes. I pulled one more file. I don't know why, some instinct. Some terrible presentiment. Kael Vrost, Medica orderly, arrested 4 months prior on charges of sedition, heretical practices, and harboring mutants. I hadn't known. She'd stopped meeting me for 7th-day meals around then. I'd assumed she was busy. I'd been busy too. Drowning in my obsessive investigation. The execution warrant was dated the 3rd day of Quintus, 4 months and 6 days ago. The investigative report was dated the 28th day of Quintus, 3 weeks later. She'd been dead for 4 months, and I hadn't known. Burned on a pyre I'd allocated promethium for. Entered in a ledger I'd verified and filed. Part of a quota I'd helped fulfill through my meticulous efficiency. I read the investigative report. My vision blurred. Had to stop, start again, read carefully. Process the information. Investigator Harron's conclusion. Subject Vrost displayed no evidence of heretical belief or seditious intent. Charges appear to have originated from personal grievance by fellow Medicare orderly who Subject Vrost reported for supply theft. Accusations of harboring mutants unfounded. Subject provided medical care to a human worker with documented imperial work permit. Recommend dismissal of all charges. She'd been innocent. Someone else had accused her falsely. She'd been investigated, found innocent, executed anyway, because the warrant was already signed, because someone needed to fill the quota, because the promethium had been requisitioned and the burial plots allocated, and the system had to justify its projections. I had filed her death record. I had verified the signatures. I had entered her name in the mortality ledgers with my immaculate devotion. The archive was very quiet. 14 degrees. Cold enough to preserve parchment. Cold enough that I could see my breath in small clouds. The servitors filed endlessly in the background, mechanical and mindless, maintaining perfect order in the documentation of systematic murder. I sat there for a long time. The data slate with Mira's file felt rough under my fingers. Parchment worn soft by handling. How many other sisters? How many other innocents? How many thousands? At some point, Proctor Malice found me. His augmetic eyes clicked and focused. Vrost, you've been here 14 hours. Your shift ended at 8th bell. I looked at him, really looked. 40 years in the archives. He knew. He had to know. You didn't process this much death for 4 decades without noticing the patterns. The warrants are predated, I said. My voice sounded strange. Distant. We execute people before we investigate them. We fill quotas. We budget for deaths before crimes are committed. Malice was quiet for a long moment. Then he pulled up a stool and sat across from me. He looked old. Older than I'd ever noticed. Tired in a way that went deeper than sleepless nights. Yes, he said simply. My sister, I know. I filed her initial documentation. I'm sorry. The apology felt absurd. Surreal, you knew. You knew this entire time and you just kept filing. What choice do I have? His voice was flat, mechanical. Dead. What choice do you have? What choice does anyone have? The system requires this. The Imperium requires this. Humanity's survival requires this. Murdering innocents, that's survival. Maintaining order. Preventing chaos. Ensuring compliance. He gestured at the archive surrounding us. 11 stories of documentation, 3 centuries of accumulated death. Do you think the Imperium survives through kindness? Through mercy? Through careful consideration of individual justice? We hold a galaxy together through fear. Through absolute certainty that deviation will be punished. The guilty must die. But more importantly, everyone must believe the guilty die. Must believe the system is watching. Is certain. Is inevitable. So we kill innocents to maintain the illusion. Why kill enough people that everyone fears us? Whether they're actually guilty becomes secondary to the demonstration of power. Your sister provided medical care to an abhuman. Technically legal, but it showed insufficient disgust toward mutation. Someone needed to reinforce that disgust. She became an example. One life to remind millions that even kindness toward the wrong people is dangerous. I stared at him. This exhausted old man with ogmetic eyes, explaining the philosophy of systematic murder like he was discussing filing protocols. The Inquisition has a text. Malice continued. The necessity of darkness. I read it during my first year here, when I started noticing what you've noticed. It argues that humanity's survival requires not just violence against external threats, but violence against itself. That populations allowed to live without fear drift toward independence, toward questioning, toward the very thinking that leads to heresy. That the Imperium must regularly sacrifice portions of itself to maintain cohesion in the whole. Your sister's death prevented 17,000 future deaths by reinforcing proper attitudes toward mutation. Those 17,000 deaths prevent millions more by maintaining order in the subsector. The math is brutal but functional. That's insane. That's Imperial doctrine, not corrupted doctrine, not doctrine twisted by chaos or incompetence. The actual, intentional philosophy of how the Imperium maintains itself across a million worlds. We are too vast for trust. Too scattered for unity. Too diverse for natural cohesion. So we hold ourselves together through systematic terror. Your job, my job, is to make that terror appear justified. To maintain the paperwork that says every execution was necessary, every death was earned, every pyre was justice rather than policy. His hand shook as he reached for his own data slate. He noticed, steadied it deliberately, pulled up a file and turned it toward me. Execution quota for next administrative year, 3,100. 12% increase. We'll need to expand burial plots in sectors 7 and 9. I filed the requisitions last month. I've been doing this for 40 years, Vrost. I know what I am. I know what we are. I sleep poorly. But I sleep better than if I'd refused and watched someone less efficient replace me and process 4,000 deaths to meet the same quotas through incompetence. I couldn't speak. Couldn't process what I was hearing. This was the man who'd praised my devotion, who'd promoted me, who'd taught me that precision mattered, that every detail in the Emperor's service deserved careful attention. You have a choice now, Malice said quietly. Continue processing the warrants, knowing what they are, or refuse, and be processed yourself. There is no third option. There is no reform. There is no appeal to higher authority, because this comes from the highest authority. This is the Imperium. This is how it works. This is how it has always worked. He stood. His joints cracked. 40 years of sitting in 14-degree archives, filing systematic murder. Take the rest of the shift. Think about it. But when you return tomorrow, either process the warrants or turn yourself in for refusal of duty. Those are your choices. He walked away. His footsteps echoed in the archive, slow and tired. The sound of a man who'd made his choice 4 decades ago and had been dying inside ever since. Quake Act 3 The Comprehension. I didn't sleep that night. Sat in my HAB unit staring at the walls, thinking about Mira, Thinking about quotas. Thinking about 2,800 deaths budgeted like promethium and ammunition and servitor labor hours. When I returned to the archive the next evening, I found 17 more pre-dated warrants on my desk. Routine processing, verify signatures, cross-reference against investigations that hadn't concluded yet, that maybe hadn't even begun, enter the names in the mortality ledgers, maintain the illusion that this was justice. I picked up the first warrant, read the name, Harvin Kellis, charged with sedition. Investigation pending, execution scheduled for 8 days hence. The investigation report was due in 15 days. He'd be dead a week before anyone determined his guilt. I could refuse. Turn myself in, be processed like Mira, become another entry in the mortality ledgers. Another number filling the quota. Or I could process the warrant. Kill Harvin Kellis with my pen and data slate. Kill 16 others. Kill however many thousands more over the coming years. Maintain the system. Become what Mullis had become, a executor masquerading as a clerk, dying inside while maintaining perfect efficiency. I thought about what Malice had said, that someone less efficient would replace me. Process more deaths through incompetence and overcorrection. It was true. The quotas would be filled regardless. My participation or refusal changed nothing about the system itself, but it changed me. I understood that now. The system didn't need monsters to function. It needed people like me, decent people, careful people, people who believed in order and precision and doing their jobs well. It needed people who could look at systematic murder and tell themselves they were just processing paperwork, just maintaining records, just following proper procedure. The horror wasn't that the Imperium was evil. The horror was that the Imperium was efficient, that it had reduced atrocity to bureaucratic routine, that people like me could participate in genocide without ever holding a weapon, without ever seeing the pyres, without ever meeting the faces we condemned. We just filed papers and verified signatures and maintained the ledgers that made it all seem reasonable. I started going through the archives again. Not investigating anymore. Understanding. I pulled execution records going back 50 years, tracked the patterns, watched the quotas rise and fall according to 5-year administrative plans, saw the surges during election cycles, new governors demonstrating strength, saw the clusters after failed tithe collections, populations reduced to match decreased productivity, saw the systematic elimination of specific populations, educators, artists, anyone whose work involved independent thought rather than rote compliance, found the philosophical justifications in Administratum policy documents, found the studies showing that regular executions reduced worker unrest, increased productivity, shortened processing times for imperial directives, found cost-benefit analyses proving that killing portions of the population was cheaper than policing it, more efficient than education, more reliable than inspiring actual loyalty. The Imperium had done the math, had determined that humanity survived not despite our systematic brutality, but because of it. That mercy was a luxury that invited chaos. That justice was secondary to fear. That individual lives meant nothing compared to species survival. And I understood, with horrible clarity, that they might be right. The galaxy was dying. Had been dying for 10,000 years. Chaos corrupted everything it touched. Xenos threatened from every border. Humanity clung to existence through tooth and nail and lasgun and pyre. What room was there for mercy when annihilation lurked behind every moment of weakness? What space for individual justice when the entire species balanced on extinction's edge? Maybe the Imperium's cruelty was necessary. Maybe this was the only way to hold 1,000,000 worlds together against infinite darkness. Maybe my sister's death, multiplied by billions across the Imperium, was the price of humanity's continuation. Or maybe that was just the lie we told ourselves to sleep at night. Maybe there was a better way, and we were too scared and too tired and too broken to find it. Maybe we were perpetuating hell because we couldn't imagine anything else. I didn't know. I would never know. That was the unbearable part. I couldn't prove the Imperium was wrong. Couldn't demonstrate that mercy would work better than terror. Couldn't show that justice would maintain order as effectively as arbitrary execution quotas. All I knew was that the system required me to kill innocents, and I had to decide whether to comply. I processed warrants for 6 more days. Killed 97 people with my careful efficiency. Entered their names in the ledgers. maintained the documentation that said their deaths were justice. On the 7th day, I stopped. Not because I'd found a way to reform the system. Not because I'd discovered hidden corruption to report. Not because I believed my refusal would change anything. I stopped because I couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't be what the Imperium needed me to be. Couldn't sacrifice my humanity for species survival. Couldn't process one more innocent death and tell myself I was serving the Emperor. Maybe that made me weak. Maybe that made me a traitor. Maybe my death would accomplish nothing except reducing efficiency in Archive Section Theta 7. But it was the only choice I could live with. The only choice that let me die as something resembling human. I began copying files. Every pre-dated warrant. Every investigation contradicting its execution. Every budget projection, every quota, every piece of evidence showing the system's true nature. 17 data, wafers hidden in 17 locations across Hive Tertius. This testimony among them. Then I walked to Proctor Malice's office and told him I wouldn't be processing any more warrants. He looked at me with his augmetic eyes, clicked and focused, servomotors grinding. Something flickered in those mechanical lenses, recognition, maybe regret, maybe just the reflection of a man who'd made the opposite choice 40 years ago. I understand, he said quietly. I'll file the notification of refusal. Arbits will come for you within the hour. I know, it won't change anything. The quotas will still be filled. Someone will replace you, the system continues. I know, then why? I thought of Mira. Thought of Tavik Soren and Harvin Kellis and 2,800 budgeted deaths. Thought of the choice between being a good servant of the Imperium and being a good person, and the impossibility of being both. Because someone has to refuse. I said, someone has to say this is wrong, even if it changes nothing. Someone has to choose their humanity over their efficiency. Otherwise we're not human anymore. We're just machines that bleed. Malice was quiet for a long time. His hand shook as he reached for the notification forms. He steadied it. Signed the paperwork that would kill me. For what it's worth, he said, I sleep poorly, have for 40 years. But tonight I'll sleep worse, knowing I could have made your choice and didn't. The Arbits came. They were efficient. Professional. They didn't beat me or torture me or demand confession. Just restraints and transport, and a cell in Precinct Isabai. The same precinct where Investigator Karis had recommended against executing Tavik Soren. Where Investigator Heron had found my sister innocent. My trial lasted 11 minutes. The charges were accurate. Refusal of duty, destruction of Imperial records. They'd found the data, wafers, seditious documentation. All true, all warranting execution. The judge didn't need to invent anything. I'd actually committed the crimes they accused me of. The warrant had been pre-signed, of course. Dated 4 days before my arrest. Someone had known I would break, had budgeted for my death, had allocated promethium for my pyre and cubic meters for my burial plot. I was a number in a quota before I even made my choice. That should have horrified me. Instead, it felt appropriate. Perfect symmetry. I'd helped maintain this system for 11 years. Now I would be processed by it. Another entry in the mortality ledgers. Another case file in Archive Section Theta 7. Maybe some clerk like I'd been would verify the signatures and cross-reference the investigation and never realize they were processing murder. They executed me at dawn. 14th day of Secundus. The pyre was efficient. Professional. The Arbits doing their jobs with the same careful precision I'd once brought to filing. The promethium was allocated properly. The burial plot had been prepared in advance. Everything according to procedure. Quati Act 4, the choice and consequence. I am dead now. I have been dead for 7 months. But before I died, I recorded this testimony. Hid it in 17 locations across Hive Tertius. Because someone must know. Someone must understand what we are. I don't know if my death mattered. Proctor Malice was right. The system continued. Someone replaced me in Archive Section Theta 7. The quotas are still being filled. Innocents are still being executed. The Imperium still runs on systematic terror disguised as justice. But I know this. The system requires our complicity. Requires people like me to process the warrants and verify the signatures and maintain the ledgers that make atrocity appear reasonable. It needs us to be efficient. To be precise. To do our jobs well without asking what our jobs actually accomplish. And I know that every person who refuses makes the system a little less efficient. Every clerk who stops filing. Every investigator who reports actual findings. Every judge who demands real evidence. We can't reform the Imperium. Can't change the philosophy or the quotas or the necessity that drives it all. But we can refuse to make it easy. Maybe humanity needs the Imperium's brutality to survive. Maybe mercy is a luxury we can't afford. Maybe the only choice is between extinction and atrocity, and our rulers chose atrocity because it keeps us breathing. But maybe there's dignity in refusing anyway, in choosing humanity over survival, in saying some costs are too high, even if that means dying for it. I processed 17,432 executions. 43% were innocent. 7,470, 5 people killed to fill quotas, maintain fear, demonstrate power. 7,470, 5 deaths I help justify with my careful efficiency. I can't undo that. Can't bring back my sister or Tavik Sorin or any of the thousands. Can't reform the system or save the millions who'll die in future quotas. All I could do was refuse to process one more. All I could do was choose to die as something resembling human, rather than live as a component in the murder machine. You who find this testimony, I cannot tell you what to do. Cannot say whether compliance or refusal is right. Cannot prove the Imperium is wrong or that there's a better way. All I can tell you is what I learned in 11 years of filing death warrants. The ledgers never lie. They show exactly what we are. And what we are is a machine that runs on blood, maintained by people who believe they're just doing their jobs. The question isn't whether you serve the Imperium. You do. We all do. The question is what price you're willing to pay for that service. What you're willing to become. How many innocents you're willing to kill with your precision and efficiency and devotion to duty. I made my choice. Now you make yours. The archive was maintained at 14 degrees. Cold enough to preserve parchment. Cold enough to preserve records of millions dead. I used to believe that meant something. That preservation of truth mattered. That careful documentation served some higher purpose. I was wrong. The truth is preserved precisely because it changes nothing. The Imperium can afford to document its atrocities because documentation doesn't threaten it. We can know exactly what we are, exactly what we do, and we'll keep doing it anyway, because we're scared, because we're tired, because we can't imagine anything else, because we're just doing our jobs. My name was Kael Vrost. I processed execution warrants for 11 years. I killed my sister with a pen and data slate. I died refusing to kill anyone else. I don't know if that redeems me. I don't know if redemption is even possible anymore. But I know I made the only choice I could live with. Even if I didn't live long.